Okay, good morning guys. Nice sunny day this morning. I'm sat in the back garden here at the moment, enjoying the sun and also playing around with some of my old feeder and ledgers. Basically reminiscing a little bit about feeder fishing, something that I've done on and off throughout the years, and I'm probably going back to when I first started fishing, I suppose, when feeder fishing really came into its own, probably in the 80s, probably late 70s. Might be a lot before a lot of the viewers were even fishing or born, but it's nice to look at history of things, and especially feeder fishing, and how it developed over the years. So much so now that they actually have World Fishing Championships, feeder championships and European championships. So I thought it'd be interesting. That's one of the reasons why I thought I'd make this little vlog. I did mention it in one of my vlogs a few vlogs ago. I did say, yeah, I'll make one about feeder fishing, because it is quite involved really when you think about it. It is a method that obviously catches fish when the standard float fishing won't catch. So anyway, I thought I'd basically go through my feeder fishing tactics. Okay, hopefully you might learn something. This video was intended for my viewers, the subscribe members, but I probably open it up as well to the public as well. And so if you want more videos like this and you like to see more tuition videos, then pop along and subscribe to my paid channel. I think it's about a $5 a month, I think, and you'll get all the full videos and the other perks that go with it. Okay, that's my advert out the way. Of course, gold medal ground baits, I'm still doing a little bit, not so much these days like I used to, because obviously sponsored by Census does make it difficult for me to to go into my ground baits in a big way. Just to say, basically, when I first started fishing the World Championships on the continent, there was not a lot of ground bait. Census and Van der Nine weren't around then. It was British ground baits or nothing. And when we come back from the World Championships, I thought, well, I learned a lot from from fishing the World Championships and on the continent, and the way they mix their ground baits and the ingredients. So I tried to learn as much as I can, and then eventually done a brand of my own. It's been successful. In fact, being a fish keeper for 20 years, I knew a little bit about the feeding of fish and what their preference are. For example, carp are brought up on pellets, and that's why if you go to most of the commercials, that's where you'll catch on. It's the same with natural food, bloodworm, joker. That's why I opt for red maggots. Although I'm sure white and bronze maggots also catch well. Anyway, that's another video or another vlog I'll probably make in the future. But anyway, I'm going to go back now to back when I was a youngster, and we used to fish. I used to fish on the local river, and feeders weren't around then. It was you either ledgered or float fish, of course. And it wasn't until I got into match fishing later on that back in the 60s and 70s even, the feeders weren't around. And then one day I saw an article, I think it was written by Ivan Marx or somebody like that anyway, and they spoke about the feeder, the new feeder method. And of course, when the feeder method come in, especially on the Trent and other venues, it started to dominate, and then all the great anglers, like Dean and people like that, they basically packed in fishing, because it made an average angler into a good angler, and possibly to win a match as well. So, probably if you look back then, you probably think to yourself, well, yeah, feeder fishing, it's a great leveler, and it does catch fish when other methods don't. And I'll explain a little bit about that as we go on through this video. Now, my first time I ever heard, as I mentioned, about the feeder was an article. And then when I looked into it, I noticed on the Trent they were using feeders, and they were using Drennan little block end feeders and catching loads of fish. Then the black caps come into it. Mal Story from Kidderminster, from the Midlands, he brought one out, and eventually it was dominating a lot of the matches. Now, looking back, I did a little bit of research on this as well, and although feeder fishing has been around a lot longer than the 60s and 70s, I've seen articles where anglers used to use, for example, hair rolling pins from their wives' hair, and they used to mould that and use that for fishing, to carry the ground bait into the swim. So, as I said, it was not really new, but it was, I suppose it was the late 60s, early 70s when it really came into its own, and it started to dominate. Well, anyway, over the years, as a match angler, you had to learn these methods. I was, it's not something that I really followed, because I preferred float fishing, and when I fished my matches, I'd always mainly set up a feeder as a secondary tactic in case the floats wouldn't work. And of course, you come into dominance, especially when the rivers become high and after a bit of rain, and float fishing couldn't adapt to the situation, so feeders fishing come into its own. So anyway, when I first started fishing, for example, the River Wye, we used to use cylinder type feeders. In fact, I'll show you now. These type of feeders, these are block end feeders with extra lead on them. Mal Story developed these, as far as I'm aware, in the Midlands, and they become very successful on the Severn, I think possibly the Trent, definitely on the Wye, and it was fantastic because these block ends, you would attach your rig obviously to the top. Now there's lots of different ways to set up your rigs, by the way. One of the most favourite ones was just a running line with a stop and your hook length, and that would then, and you could obviously change the length of the hook length by pushing up the stops or shots. You should a couple of split shots up the line, and you could, if you like, lengthen the tail, and that was, with a swivel, of course, and that would become very, very popular. Now, obviously later on, open-ended feeders come into it, and that was basically similar, but obviously with the caps taken off, and the ground would be pushed in there, of course, cast out, and the water would eventually push the ground bait out. Now, with these Drennan feeders, Drennan come into its own then, and I'll show you a Drennan feeder, and he started to develop a far superior one, especially for still waters, with leads on the bottom. Again, swivel attachments. Again, you can link, you can have a running line on it. My preferred choice, by the way, is a loop. So you basically make a loop on the line, small loop, and then you put your hook length. And that becomes, if you like, almost like a stopper. So it basically, when you get a bite and it pulls the line through the swivel, it'll actually self-hook, the fish will self-hook. And that become my favourite way of rigging most of my my feeders up. Now, many years ago, when we used to fish deep lakes or deep ponds up in the valleys, a place called Pond Stickle, it's about 20-30 foot deep in places, and of course we used to use open-ended feeders. And what we used to do then, rather than have a running line, we would form like, I suppose you call it a helicopter rig these days, or like a pattern hoister. So when you have your line coming from the rod, from the reel down to your feeder, you tie a little loop, and then you put another loop, hooked nylon loop on it, so it basically comes like a pattern oyster style. So when you get a bite, it's actually pulling the tip of the rod and not the feeder. And you can obviously, higher up you go, the more chance you have a fish on the drop. And we used to use the old swing tips in them days. Now, swing tips probably become a little bit redundant later on when quiver tips become developed and they become a lot finer and more sensitive. But I can remember going back, I was only a youngster, and going on the Huntsbill, fishing a national, and I remember all the Ivan, Max, Likey lads, they come down, and they were using these, I thought when I first saw it, I thought the tip of the rod had broke, but on closer inspection, it was actually it was a attachment attached to the end of the rod, and it became a bite indicator basically, and they were very, very good. In fact, they went on to win the national championships on the Huntsbill when I was only a youngster, and it was a great learning curve, that, because then we adopted that method, the swing tip, on places like Pondstickle, Dollygair, and a lot of the reservoirs that we fish. Even on a place like Roath Park, my local venue, we used to have winter matches, and a swing tip would be the only way you could actually see those little bites. We also developed to catch fish on the drop as well with the swing tip. And what you do, you cast out in 20-30 foot of water, you tighten the swing tip, and you'd watch it slow down, and then you'd retrieve some line, and you'd basically straighten the tip up again, and you'd watch it drop, and all of a sudden if it stopped, sometimes you go back up, and that's a bite, and that's usually on the drop, or as the tail is on the drop, on the bottom I should say, because obviously when you throw it in, there's a big loop in the line, and then you have to keep retrieving it. But it becomes very sensitive and a very great method for catching shy biting fish like roach and skimmers and perch. Of course, as time developed, as I mentioned, quiver tips come into their own. What we used to do with the swing tips is we used to also put a little bit of lead or a little bit of weight on it to weigh it down sometimes, because the wind would blow it, or a toe of the water would blow it up and you wouldn't quite get it, so you would basically just add a little bit of weight to it, and that's how we overcome that. Of course, as I said again, later on when tackle developed and quiver tips come into it, then basically you ended up with a sensitive tip indicator, far better than something flopping around on the end of the rod. In fact, I've got some in the garage. I'll go and get some. Okay, well here we are. There they are. That's the quiver tip. This is like a spring quiver tip, by the way, and that gives the same indication, but not only would you have a very soft, flexible tip, but you also have the spring action as well. That's one. That's the old screw-in sort of quiver tips. And with a swing tip, you'd have another attachment then to the rod, and it would hang basically like that. And then when you get a bite, it would obviously go like that. We also use target boards as well. We used to have a little square target board, and we'd line up the indicator against the target board with a little black spot, and of course it would you could see the very finest bites then. In fact, I'm surprised people don't use them so more these days, but I think the way feeder fishing's gone, especially on still water, a lot of them are boat rigs anyway, so all you do is just tighten it up, and obviously the fish hook themselves, especially on commercials. But that's another that's another aspect to the feeder fishing, which I'll talk about shortly anyway. Now, when I first started using swim feeders, it was basically mainly on the rivers, and I'm going to tell you a little story that in my younger days I used to do a little bit of sea fishing and a little bit of trout fishing and that sort of thing. And I remember going on, I was invited on a boat once in the Bristol Channel with a local tackle shop, Mike Miles, and the boat I remember was called the Colby. Anyway, I remember going on there, and it was in the winter, and I don't know if you know the Bristol Channel, but it's a big ebb and flow. I mean, you're talking about 20-30 foot ebb and flow, and to hold bottom out on the boats in this channel, they'd use very heavy weights, but even a pound weight wouldn't hold bottom. So what they used to do, they used to basically put a big bow in the line, called uptide casting, if you like. They cast it sort of in front of them and they let the line out and it would create a bow. And that way it would hold bottom. Now, if you study water, if you study rivers, you'll know what I mean, because most rivers, the flow of the water is actually faster on the top and slower on the bottom. Why I know this, I remember a friend of mine's a diver, used to go diving in rivers, and he used to say how the difference between the surface of a river and the bottom of the river is, and how slow it is compared with the surface. So, you know, and this is very interesting to know, by the way, because obviously when you're feeding, the top surface will take the bait downstream, but as soon as it gets to a certain level, it'll actually reach a bottom, and it'll almost come, not slow, but it slows you right up. And in some cases it'll stay still, especially behind boulders and so on. But that's an interesting thing. So the idea was, we were fishing on the rivers, and I thought, well, let's try this this bow in a line, because what we used to do, we used to put a feeder out, or a lead out if you like, and it would hold bottom, but it would come off all the time. We couldn't keep it in the same spot. So I thought, well, let's try this upboat tide casting, if you like. So basically cast the feeder in front of you, not down, but in front of you, and then as that sunk, you know, you probably use a heavy feeder, you then put a big bow in a line. So basically the weight, the feeder would stay on the bottom, the feeder would stay on the bottom, and the loop of line which would go around to your rod, and that would hold the bottom. Now when you get a bite, what used to happen, the fish would basically, like a boat rig, would hook themselves, and the tip of the rod would bounce back, and you got your fish. And that's anyway, it worked a treat, and it caught on. And as far as I know, whether I was the first one to do this, I don't know, but certainly it was a method that caught on, and afterwards everyone used this bow in a line method. I did write an article about it, and I'm going back 30, 40 years ago, or even 50 years ago now. I'm 74 now, so yeah, it was, must have been when I was in the 30s, so yeah, talking about 40 years ago. Anyway, so that became one of the most popular methods, especially fishing in Hawaii, and I think it probably caught on in a lot of other running water venues as well. Now, coming back to still water, we never used a block end, it was always an open-ended feeder. And in them days, we used to use, if you like, just plain feeders, which we used to take the tops off, and that would be, if you like, become a cylinder. Later on, I developed these without the holes in. What we used to do in them days, of course, we used to wrap tape around the holes, so the the bait wouldn't come out so much. Ideal, especially for running water, because you don't want it all coming out as it's falling through the water. So basically, we used to wrap it up. And I tell you, a place I used to fish a lot was Port Talbot Docks down in South Wales, and it was in its heyday, it was brilliant. You used to catch like 100, nearly 100-pound bags, but most matches would be won with 40, 50 pound. And the way to catch them was with a feeder, and that was with a conventional feeder it wouldn't work, because most of the bait would fall out by the time it got to the bottom. So we used to tape it up so it would, at least when it hit the bottom, and simply just jerking it, the bait will come out on the bottom. And that's how that developed. Of course, taping up your feeders was all very well, but what used to happen, the tape used to come off like that. It's coming off there now. So I developed feeders without putting tape on it, just a cylinder. Now these I picked up, well actually I picked them up from a plumbing shop, but you can, if you've got any old rod holders, rod tip holders, then you can use that. And that's what I've done there, just cut them off to certain sizes, strip a lead on it, put your link and a swivel on, and you've got an open-ended feeder without taping it up. And being plastic, it obviously it's almost invisible then when it falls on the bottom. So there's another little tip there for you. Okay, so that's how we developed on the still waters, and that's how we used to fish ground bait on the rivers as well. And what we used to do, when as it depends on the flow of the water, it depends on the weight as well, because even though you put a big bow in the line, sometimes it just wouldn't hold. So then these were developed, which are little lead strips. Okay, and we used to just put that onto the feeder. Basically, you clip it on, so it would give it extra weight, and therefore then that would secure and hold the bottom. Later on, we start getting, you know, bigger ones like that, big 30, 40, 50 gram ones, which will just wrap around the feeder. Again, the same thing, you just wrap it around, and that would then hold the bottom. So there you are. So that's a little tip. Of course, ski leads they were called. I think they're still available now. You can get them in doubles, singles. You know, you could even take some off old feeders and put them onto new feeders if you like. So that was another method that we used to use for open-ended feeders. Of course, with block ends, we would still keep the block ends on them. So it became quite a versatile feeder. This, you could take the block ends off, if you like, to become open-ended feeders, and that's it. So coming back to still waters, so what we used to do with this, the still waters, eventually we started using cage feeders. Now you can get plastic ones like that. Again, you can get metal ones like that. Yeah. Again, what we should do, that's a cage feeder, but I've actually taped that up. That's before I started making the cylinder plastic type. So that's another method. These days you can get them all size. You can get them down to little mini sizes as well. Yeah. And you can even get them loaded as well. Okay, for long distance fishing as well. So that's perfect. Weight on the bottom, you put your swivel on there and that'll fly out. Now, as time developed, of course, the new feeders come on the market, method feeders, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the Drennan feeders were very, very popular in them days, and that was basically, they become front-loaded, easy to cast, almost like a bullet. Obviously, you put your different rigs on it. You can then easy fill it, just take the top off, fill it with maggots, put the top back on with a nylon insert which holds it together, and they come in all different sizes, you know, from big sizes, large, and even little mini sizes like that, say, little mini sizes. Later on, people used to develop them like this. They used to put their own line through, a couple of shots on the bottom, then you put your swivel on the top, and that would become, if you like, you know, a good attachment, almost like, if you like, a helicopter rig. So then the fish will be pulling that rather than the feeder. Okay. Later on, people developed putting a line through it, and then become almost like a boat shock leader, boat rig. So that was another method. Another block end feeder was sort of like a flat end one. They developed these that basically laid on the ground, and so it stopped it rolling from the swim, and these become very, very popular, especially on the rivers and the Wye and that sort of thing. Also, with open-ended feeders, the problem is with ground bait, sometimes it's out of your swim before you know, as soon as it settles, and you know, at least with an open-ended feeder, sorry, block-end feeder, the maggots would just, you know, gradually creep out, you know. So, and you'd fill it with hemp as well, and these days you put pellets and all sorts of casters and all that sort of thing in. But as I mentioned, going back a little bit back in history with Ivor Max, because he was the, I suppose, well, he was the name that brought it to the front. Whether he was the first to use swim feeders or not, I don't know. But I used to read his articles, and I remember him telling me once about the swim feed is a good leveler because it determines how often you feed. So in other words, if you fill a feeder up, okay, and you cast it out and you get a bite straight away, obviously you're reeling it in, you're filling it, the feeder back up and you cast it, and if you get a bite straight away, then you're constantly feeding. Now, if you don't get a bite for 5 or 10 minutes, it's telling you not to bring the feeder in. Obviously, at the start of a match, you probably put a couple in anyway, and by doing that, you obviously put a little trap, a little bed down, and then, but that would always determine how often the fish would come into your swim. Now, if you study fish and study underwater footage these days, you'll see what I mean, because basically what happens, bream, carp and that, they show obviously, and they come round and they'll have a little peck and then they'll swim off, or they get spooked. If you hook one, sometimes they get spooked, but they eventually come back. Like cows grazing in the field, they'll eat and they'll just go away and then they'll come back and so on. So that open-ended feeder always determined how often you fed the swim, and depending on how many bites you get. Right, now Ivan was a great tactician, and he also came up with a method, or he came up with a feeder, and he called it the Harrier feeder. Now the Harrier feeder basically was developed like a tube, but instead of holes you'd have slots in it, and it's shaped in such a way that basically when you struck, as soon as you retrieved it, comes straight to the surface. Now this was fantastic, especially on places like the Witham and the Welland, where you had a lot of weed, to contend with between you and where you're fishing. Also the Huntsville and places like that where I fish. And what we found, that it was fantastic. I never see them around these days, but it's called the old Harrier. They come in different sizes. You can even put little links on them as well. I've still got a couple there. And the good thing about these is that you could plug it with ground bait, and because of the slots, you could pack it in tight as well. And although there's no weight to that, most of it would be in the weight of the ground bait. So as you cast out, and it would sink, of course, and eventually come out. And then, as I say, if you hook a fish, or you don't hook a fish, as soon as you retrieve it, it comes to the surface, and it stayed on the surface, and it's fantastic. Now later on we use these sort of methods down at Port Talbot Dock, as I mentioned, because a lot of the fish used to catch actually on the drop in 30 foot of water, and because of the particles used to come out of the feeders, sometimes they would linger in mid water, and the fish would come up, and you'd be watching your tip, and it'd be going whoop whoop like that as the fish are taking it, especially roach, but skimmers as well, and even bream, even they would come up in the water. Now what we done later on, I actually I don't know if you see that, but that's cork, and what you should do is put a bit of cork into these feeders, and then basically it would be very, very slow sinking indeed. In fact, you could put them in all sorts of feeders, just trim it down and put a bit of cork. That's a bottle cork, by the way, and that would slow the feeder down through the water, if you want that sort of method where you're catching sort of on the drop. So that's a little tip there for you. Anyway, when I down at East Dock was the same as well. That was quite deep, and again, that's another method we used to use. But Port Talbot in particular, I had a great run down there. I was in the frame nearly every match. If you look back at my vlogs a few years ago when we used to fish it, you'll see I was in the main money all the time. And basically it was down to these taped up feeders, sometimes on the drop. And what I would do, and this is something that I noticed that a lot of anglers don't do these days, I never use a rod rest. I just use the rod and I tighten it up, and then I would move it an inch or two, and quite often I'd have a fish on the end without actually seeing the bite. Now I know these days a lot of, especially when it comes to method feeder, a lot of people use 4-inch and 5-inch hook lengths, but I used to find that sometimes the fish wouldn't come that close to the feeder, but they would stay around it. So I'd always have a hook length of about 8 to 10 inches, but I would keep it constantly working because I just keep moving it, and quite often you'd have a fish on the end. Now, if you've ever seen these underwater videos, by the way, with the guys now, technology's come a long way now, and they can actually see what's underneath the water and how the fish feed. And they actually got the bait in their mouth before any indication on the tip. And my method would eliminate that, because I would constantly be doing this, and quite often, as I said, I'd have a fish on the hook, and I'd have 2 or 3 fish before anyone else had any around me, because they're still waiting for that tip to go around. of course, everyone to its own, but that's a little method that I developed, and I still use it to this day. So that is basically keep it moving, and this works well on still water. On rivers, you can do the same, by moving it and just lifting it, and sometimes that little bit of movement will either attract the fish, or sometimes if the fish has got it in his mouth and hasn't swum away to give you an indication, it'll be on your hook. So it's quite interesting. So if you ever watch any of these underwater videos, you see what I mean, and it's surprising how many times, even flow fishing, by the way, the amount of time that the fish have got the bait in their mouth and there's no indication on the float. So that's something to learn, and that's a great method of feeder fishing on still waters. Now, coming back to the commercials. Now, when the commercials come into its own, people started using, if you like, method feeders. Now, method feeders are a completely different thing, because basically it's like a frame feeder. I suppose you know what they are anyway. I'm talking to probably anglers who fish regular anyway, but in case it's a beginner, it's basically a frame that you mold your ground bait around. And then more often than not, you put your bait into the actual mold of ground bait, or pellets. Sometimes you use damp sticky pellets, and then as you cast out, of course, as it dissolves, the fish come around, and that's where they use short hook lengths. And again, 3, 4 inches, 5 inches hook lengths. Again, it'd be like a boat rig, so when they get a bite, they would pull the feeder and the whole thing, and it would hook themselves. Now, later development, of course, was the mold that you actually put your pellets or your ground bait in. You put it in, you squeeze it tight so you get a good firm hold. You press it on the bottom, and like it's soft on the bottom, that would pop out, and you'd have your ground bait on it. Now, I'm going to tell you something, another story that back in the late 60s, 70s, our team, Cardiff Nomads, we were quite a strong team in them days. We used to travel all over the country to fish matches, and on one particular occasion, we qualified for a semi-final Angling Times Winter League, and it was down on the Kentish Stour down in Dorset. And I remember travelling with all the boys. At that particular moment, I was still young. I wasn't picked for the team, but I was doing a bit of running because obviously I could learn a lot as well. Now, a good friend of mine, Richard Bainton, who unfortunately is not fishing anymore, but he was a great angler, and he did go on and become third in the World Championships one year in Bulgaria, 1989. But Richard was a very technical angler. Now, I'm talking about back long before feeders actually were known on the marketplace. And I was doing a bit of running for him. Anyway, he was on a bend of a river, and he was absolutely pulverizing the match. In fact, he won the match for the team on his own. And what he done was interesting, because he used a bomb, an RC bomb. By the way, an RC bomb is like a pear-shaped bomb. And why they call it the Arsley bomb is because the famous legend Dick Walker he developed a weight on the river, on the Arsley Lakes, and he then called it the Arsley bomb. So it stuck. That name stuck for many, many years, and still, even to this day, people call it the Arsley bomb. But it's basically a lead bomb. And what he done, which is very interesting, because he got his ground bait and he molded it around the actual RC bomb. And what he would do, he'd swing it out into the middle of the river. Of course, this is long before feeder fishing came into its own. So basically, it was like a feeder. The ground bait obviously would break up, and he'd have his hook length trailing from it, and he went on and won the match, £33 a bream. He won it for the team, and we went on to the final. And incidentally, we won the final in Ireland, as well. I didn't go with the team, unfortunately. I was a bit young, but if I got a photograph of it, I'll put it on, and you see the old team that won the Anglian Times. We beaten Cofton Hackett at the time, which were the best team in the country, and it was a great honour to actually win and for the club to win that. So that was, as I say, reminiscent old days. But as I say, history has a way of repeating itself, and today we're using methods very similar to that, very similar, I would call the method feeder. So the method feeder comes in various feeders, and with a method feeder, of course, you would, depending on your mix, but you would mould it. I've got a tray full there, I don't know if you can see them, all different shapes and sizes and weights, and they're basically the same. You thread it through the middle, unlike a conventional feeder where you put a swivel or helicopter rig or a pattern oyster rig. So what you would do then is basically run the line through it, which is, again, it's a great method, especially for carp, and bream, because they home in on that ball of ground bait that's wrapped around this, and quite often they'll suck the ground. Because I can remember fishing the River 7 years ago, and they were fishing feeders, and what they were doing, they were actually putting an elastic band on the with a hook on it, because what used to happen, the barb used to nudge the feeder, because we used to fish it, and the tip would be going like this, and he'd be striking nothing on it, and then some bright angler suggested, well, they must be attacking the feeder. So what they done then, they actually put on a little elastic band, just round the feeder, and they just push it in, so when the barb will come and knock the feeder, they'd hook themselves, and that was another method that caught on very well. So if you look at the method feeder, it's very similar, because short hook leads, they attack the ground bait, or they attack the feeder, and that's how they catch them. Anyway, I know I'm diversifying, I'm hopping from one to another, but I'm coming back to modern day now. Now, a very good friend of mine, Bob Nudd, world champion, as you know, 4 times, he actually developed a feeder which is called the window feeder. Now, the window feeder is basically a feeder that you can use ground bait in, or you can use a combination of loose feed and ground bait. You put your feed in, and you plug it with a bit of damp ground bait, and that would suffice. You cast that out, and of course, the only problem is, of course, you can't put a lot of bait in them, but these are ideal for long distance fishing. Because I'm going to tell you another story, because again, I was in Ireland going back a few years ago now, and I think this must have been at least a year after Bob developed them. How he developed them, by the way, I don't know if you've seen the vlog, but I had him on a vlog once, and he went through the method of how he developed it, and he actually had a Drennan feeder, and he thought an idea of how can he get ground bait in there that'll come out quickly. So what he done, he cut the holes away and made it like a window in it, and then that become, if you like, the start of a window feeder. Well, at the time, I think he was working with Browning. He went back to the drawing board and designed it, and so he was then honoured with the fact that he was the first one to develop the window feeder. Now, the story I'm going to tell you is quite interesting, because I was in Ireland, as I mentioned, and I had a young lad to me, and we were fishing, and do you know what? The distance he was getting is unbelievable. He must have been doing 100 yards or more. He must have been, because I tried my best. With a shock leader, with a conventional feeder, even ones with with a weight on the bottom, and these used to fly through the air like I'd probably get 70 yards, 80 yards. But this lad was doing. He was outgunning me 20, 30 yards. Of course, he went on and won the section. In that year, he actually went on to win the festival itself, the one I was fishing. Now, I'm not sure which one, I wish I could remember, but all I remember is that I went up to him after the match. I said, how are you getting those distances? And he showed me this. And it's like a bullet almost. It's quite heavy, and when it flies through the air, it does fly like a bullet. Anyway, I thought, oh God. I said, where'd you get them from? He said, oh, the window feeders. I said, oh. He said, Bob Nudd made them. I said, oh, I know Bob. Anyway, as luck had happened, as I packed up that day, I went over the brow of a hill, and who should be there in the car was Bob Nudd. And I said to Bob, I said, hey, what's these window feeders? He said, well, haven't you got one? Haven't you seen one? I said, no. hang on a minute. He went to the back of the car. He gave me a whole bag of them. Well, thanks, Bob, by the way. That was fabulous because they lasted me about 2 or 3 seasons before I lost them all eventually, because you do eventually lose them. But that was the start of the window feeder, and it is still used even to this day, and I use them, and especially for those long distances, and they're perfect for getting into little spots on the rivers. For example, if you want to fish the far side of a river, a wide river like I suppose the Wye and the Trent, you could actually cast it right into, so accurate that because of the bullet you can actually cast right exactly where you want it to go. So as I said, that become a little method again. How you would put the terminal rig on determines you can have a running line, loop to loop, or any method you want, but fantastic little method that. Anyway, as I said, coming back to today's modern feeders, then I'm looking back at some old feeders I got there, old green things, little bottles on them. Of course, a bit obsolete now. I wouldn't probably use them now. And of course, as method feeders have developed, again, you can also get feeders that have got, if you like, you could thread your line through them, and they become a ground bait feeder, similar to a method feeder. Oh, here's something I want to show you. This is an old rocket feeder as well. These are basically for distance fishing, but without the weight on them. Again, I suppose you would use that for spodding, if you like. In fact, I got a very big one in my box that I use. There, up in there. And I'll use that as a spodding, if you like. When I'm starting the match, I'd probably put 3, 4, 5 of these in. And I would then obviously take it off, and I put the smaller feeder on then to fish it up, because you don't want to fish that whole match unless, of course, you're on a shed full of fish, and they do want a lot of ground bait. Now, feeder fishing is all very well, as I say, but you still got to get your right mixes for the ground bait feeders. With feeder fishing, with, if you like, maggot feeder fishing, a little tip I like to use. I know a lot of people, because I developed a ground bait called a Black Magic explosive feeder that basically used to explode, and you get particles rising out of the water to the surface, and people say, well, you don't really want that, you don't want the fish on the top, you want them on the bottom, which is fair enough, but in some cases it's a great way of getting fish to your swim. Now, a little tip I do sometimes when I'm using maggots is I'll dunk some maggots into an inch of water, let them have a drink so they become floaters. I would then put floaters as well as sinkers into the feeder, and that's a great method then of drawing fish, if you like, into the swim. Okay, you might get them on the surface a little bit, and you might even get them on the bottom. But the other secret, which I'm going to tell you, is basically when you put your maggot on the hook, use a floating maggot, because that counterbalances the weight of the hook. Okay, now there is different ways of hooking a maggot, and again, that was on a video that I made many years ago. Whether I can put a clip of that on it in a moment, maybe, that's might be worth looking at. But again, as I said, it's the mixes is the most important. Whether to put a sloppy mix in, or to put a hard mix into the ground bait, or not, and whether you lose or whether you just loose feed it with a block end. Incidentally, another thing that's definitely worth looking at is if you are fishing an open-ended feeder, sometimes it's worth just putting a block end in. So without actually introducing ground bait, you're just introducing the loose feed into your ground bait. So again, it's something worth looking at. And another method, of course, is the bomb. You put a straight bomb over it. Okay. Later on, they did develop these weights with actually like a little feeder in it, where you can actually put a little bit of ground bait in, and that would act then almost like a bomb. Yeah, I've got a couple of them to show you. See, mini feeders there, little mini feeders. Yeah, there's one, for example. See, So you can actually put a little bit of ground bait in, only just enough to give it that little flavour, but without overfeeding the fish. So that, again, you could put that over your swim, especially if you don't want to put ground bait and you just want a little bit of smell or something active. Gives you a little bit of confidence knowing that there's something in the water. Right, another development with lead fishing as well, by the way. Years ago when we used to fish rivers, we used to sometimes we used to use bullets, and they used to roll a little bit. Then we would use RC bombs, and then in the end we'd flatten a bit of lead out like that, so that would grip the bottom, and that would stop it from rolling out of the swim. We also used, now I don't know if you're seeing them, the old light sea weights as well, the crabs, what we call crab weights. And that used to be perfect for holding the bottom as well. Very, very fast water. There's a slightly smaller one. That's maybe not for big rivers like the Wye, perhaps for the Avon and places. But again, another little flat lead. We still use the round ones, of course. Still use round leads. And that's basically more for still water, I would think. Although sometimes you can use them for flowing rivers as well. So basically, that's that's how feeder fishing has developed over the years. You've got to ring the changes sometimes. Sometimes you go, don't feed with a feeder. Use a lead or straight lead over the top of it. I know these days on the, for example, barbel fishing, especially on the Wye, probably the rivers, the Severn, the Trent, and places where fish are not daft. They know what a feeder is these days. Sometimes on commercials it's different because they're looking for food because they know they're being fed. But natural rivers, obviously, sometimes they shy off from a feeder. And what they're doing now, they're putting leads on, and they're putting huge tails, long tails. Somebody started developing long tails with the feeder, but it was the feeder that used to, as I say, used to spook the fish, especially barbel. So now these days, what they do, a friend of mine recently, Kevin Dix, he just won the league, and he was telling me how he fishes the feeder, and how he puts a bomb on it and downstream from it, and keep moving it and jigging it and so on. And fair to him, he went on and won the individual league this year, and he was in the worst section, A section, up on the river on the Wye, in the Wye Winter League, and fair dues to him. Now, I'm not saying I'm a great feeder man, because I'd rather fish afloat, and I'd rather be a natural angler than the feeder fishing. Although feeder fishing, as I said before, can produce when other methods don't, especially on coloured waters and running waters. Obviously, commercials, it's a must for some people. You have to use it. I remember when I first started trying these on commercials. I don't fish a lot of commercials. Something I might look at into now. Now I'm retired, I got more time to do it. I might give some commercials to go, but I'm more of a natural angler, and I do prefer the flow fishing, rod and line and sometimes pole fishing. But anyway, when I first started using these meta feeders, they also had elastic that used to run through it as well. And I remember going down to one fishery down in the West Country, and the bailiff came around and said, "Oh, you can't use elastic on you in your feeder." So, oh God. And that's the problem, of course, is that there's a lot of rules and regulations you have to watch, especially with commercial fishing, about your feeder fishing. There's a pond, there's a fishery that I fish in Newport now, and they're saying that you can't have a boat rig, you can't have a loop in your line like I normally do. You've got to have it running, so obviously be careful where you go and where you're fishing, and make sure you get the rules right before you change or you use a feeder. Okay, well, thanks for listening. As I say, it's only a short vlog, but at least it might give you an insight. As I said, this is for members only, but I might release it, and if you're not a member, then please subscribe, and if you want to pay your monthly sub of about $4.99, call it a fiver. You'll get insights into things that the average anglers or the average viewer won't get. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you on the bank soon. Best of luck, Clive Branson, and don't forget, gold medal ground weights.